The blood on Ophelia Carson's apron had finally dried by the time the women started their cruel gossip in the mercantile, their words cutting deeper than any wound she had tended that morning in her father's medical office. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the bolts of fabric before her, auburn hair falling forward like a curtain to shield her burning cheeks as their laughter echoed through the cramped space. "Did you see how she practically ran from Thomas Wheeler yesterday?" Martha Henderson whispered loud enough for half the store to hear. Poor man only tipped his hat to her, and she turned red as a beet and scurried off like a frightened rabbit. "She's too shy to even look at men," giggled Sarah Whitmore, her voice dripping with amusement and something harder beneath it. 20 years old and still acts like she's never seen a fellow before. How does she expect to find a husband when she cannot even meet a man's eyes?" Ophelia's fingers trembled as she traced the edge of a calico print, fighting the urge to flee just as they had described. It was November in Lade, South Dakota, and the year was 1878. The town had sprung up quickly after gold was discovered in the Black Hills just a few years prior, and with it came rough miners, desperate prospectors, and women like Martha and Sarah, who had married quickly, and now seemed to measure their worth by how many other women remained unwed. "My mother says Dr. Carson spoiled that girl," Martha continued, selecting a spool of thread with deliberate slowness. "Let her read all those medical books instead of teaching her proper feminine arts. What man wants a wife who knows more about setting broken bones than setting a proper table?" The words struck home because Ophelia knew there was truth in them, even if the delivery was meant to wound. Her father, widowed when she was just 6 years old, had indeed raised her differently than most daughters in Lade. Dr. Henry Carson had no sons to follow in his profession, and when young Ophelia had shown an aptitude for healing and a gentle touch with patients, he had encouraged it. By 15, she could identify most medicinal herbs and assist in basic surgical procedures. By 18, she was essentially running his practice while he dealt with the more complex cases that came down from the mining camps in the surrounding hills. But her father had given her something else too, something she had never quite named until moments like this made it burn in her chest. He had given her the belief that she had value beyond her ability to smile prettily and make small talk. He had taught her that her mind mattered, that her skills mattered, that she could contribute something meaningful to the world beyond bearing children and keeping house. The problem was that this belief had come with a crippling shyness around anyone who might see her differently. When miners came to town, and their eyes lingered too long, when young prospectors tried to strike up conversations on the boardwalk, when eligible bachelors attended the church socials specifically to meet unmarried women, Ophelia found herself paralyzed. Her throat would close, her cheeks would flame, and her eyes would fix themselves firmly on the ground until the men moved on to friendlier prospects. It was not that she disliked men or found them frightening in any threatening way. It was that she could not reconcile the two versions of herself. At her father's side, wearing her bloodied apron and focused on saving lives, she was confident and capable. But faced with a man looking at her as a woman rather than as Dr. Carson's assistant, she became someone else entirely. Someone small and uncertain and utterly tongue-tied. "I heard there is a new fellow up in one of the camps," Sarah was saying now, and despite herself, Ophelia found her ears straining to hear. "They say he is a mountain of a man, bigger than any miner in these parts. Came down from Montana territory looking for something, though nobody seems to know what. Probably gold like all the rest," Martha said dismissively. "Though I cannot imagine what use a mountain man would have for gold. They live like savages up in the high country hunting and trapping." Probably does not even know what civilization looks like. My husband says he helped pull 3 men out of a collapsed shaft last week, Sarah continued, her voice taking on a different quality now, almost admiring. Said this fellow moved timbers that should have taken 4 men to shift. Strong as an ox and twice as stubborn, apparently. Ophelia paid for her fabric and fled before the conversation could continue, her heart hammering in her chest even though the women had not been directly addressing her. The November air bit at her cheeks as she hurried down the wooden boardwalk, her parcel clutched to her chest like armor. Lead was not a large town, but it was prosperous enough to have proper streets and buildings rather than the tent cities that characterized some of the newer mining settlements. Still, it retained that rough edge common to all frontier towns, where fortunes could be made or lost in a single day, and violence lurked just beneath a thin veneer of respectability. Her father's office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on Main Street, with their living quarters above. The sign hanging outside read, Dr. Henry Carson, physician and surgeon, in neat black letters, though everyone in town knew that half the time it was Ophelia who answered their calls. Her father was 63 now, and while his mind remained sharp as ever, his hands had developed a tremor that made certain procedures difficult. She found him bent over his desk when she entered, spectacles perched on his nose as he studied a medical journal that had arrived from Philadelphia the previous week. He looked up as the bell above the door chimed, and his weathered face creased into a smile. "Did you find what you needed?" he asked, nodding toward her parcel. "Yes, Papa." She set the fabric on the counter and began removing her coat and hat. "Though I might have saved myself the trip and ordered through the catalog, the Henderson and Whitmore women were there." Her father's expression shifted, understanding flooding his kind eyes. He set down his journal and removed his spectacles, rubbing the bridge of his nose where they had left red marks. "They are unhappy women, Ophelia. Try not to let their words find purchase in your heart." "They said I am too shy to ever find a husband," she said quietly, busying herself with hanging her coat so she would not have to meet his eyes. "They are probably right." "They are decidedly wrong," her father said firmly. "You simply have not met the right man yet. When you do, you will know. Trust me on this." Ophelia wanted to believe him, but at 20 years old in a frontier town where women were outnumbered by men 3-1, her continued unmarried status felt less like patience and more like failure. Most girls her age were already wives and mothers, their lives settled into predictable patterns of childbearing and housekeeping. She should want that too, should not she? Should want it enough to overcome this paralyzing shyness that kept her eyes fixed on the ground whenever an eligible man came near. The afternoon brought a steady stream of patients. A miner with a crushed finger that needed setting, a child with a nasty cough that required a tonic, a prospector's wife suffering from headaches that Ophelia suspected had more to do with her husband's drinking than any physical ailment. She moved through the cases with practiced efficiency, her hands steady and her voice calm as she explained treatments and offered comfort. It was nearly sunset when the door burst open and 3 men carried in a fourth, his leg bent at an unnatural angle and his face white with pain and shock. Ophelia recognized 2 of the carriers as miners from the Homestake operation, the largest and most successful mine in the area. The third man she had never seen before, and despite the urgency of the situation, her breath caught in her throat at the sight of him. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the doorway. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, pale gray like storm clouds, and currently focused entirely on the injured man they were carrying. "Shaft collapse," one of the miners gasped out. "Caught his leg bad. We brought him straight here." "Put him on the table," Ophelia heard herself say, her professional instincts overriding her usual awkwardness. She was already rolling up her sleeves and moving toward the examination table, her mind cataloging what she would need. "Papa, I will need chloroform and the surgical kit." Her father was already moving, years of partnership making words unnecessary. The injured miner was moaning now, semi-conscious and in terrible pain. Ophelia positioned herself at his side, her hands already exploring the injury with gentle but firm pressure. "Compound fracture of the tibia and fibula, likely some muscle damage, but if they could set it properly and ward off infection, he might keep the leg." "You will need to hold him down," she said, finally looking up at the three men who had brought him in. Her eyes skated past the two regular miners and landed on the giant, then immediately darted away. "This will hurt terribly even with the chloroform, and he will try to move." "I can hold him," the big man said, and his voice was like distant thunder, deep and rumbling. "Where do you need me?" Ophelia forced herself to meet his eyes just long enough to gesture to the head of the table. "Hold his shoulders down, firmly but not so hard you injure him further. Talk to him if you can, try to keep him calm." What followed was an hour of intense, focused work. Ophelia lost herself in it the way she always did, her world narrowing to the injury before her, and the steps needed to repair it. Her father administered the chloroform and assisted, but it was her hands that cleaned the wound, aligned the bones, and stitched the torn flesh back together. She was dimly aware of the big man at the head of the table, his massive hands holding the patient steady with surprising gentleness, while he murmured words of encouragement in that deep, quiet voice. When it was finally done, when the leg was set and splinted and the patient was resting as comfortably as could be expected, Ophelia stepped back and found her hands shaking with delayed reaction. Her apron was covered in blood, her hair had come loose from its pins, and she was suddenly aware that all three men were staring at her. "That was some fine doctoring, miss," one of the miners said, genuine admiration in his voice. "I have seen trained physicians do worse." "My father did most of it," she demurred automatically, her eyes finding the floor. "Your father handed you instruments," the big man said, and there was something in his voice that made her glance up despite herself. He was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, those storm-gray eyes intense in his bearded face. "You saved that man's leg, maybe his life." Their eyes met for a brief second before Ophelia's gaze skittered away like a frightened deer. Her cheeks were burning, and she could feel her heart hammering in her chest. She mumbled something about needing to clean up and practically fled to the back room, leaving her father to discuss the patient's care with the miners. She was still trying to calm her racing pulse when her father found her a few minutes later. He studied her face with the same careful attention he gave to his patients, and she knew he had seen the whole thing. The way she had looked at the stranger, the way she had fled when he looked back. "His name is Franklin Brennan," her father said quietly. "He has a claim up in one of the northern camps. The miners say he mostly keeps to himself, but he is quick to help when there is trouble." "Why are you telling me this?" Ophelia asked, though her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Because you looked at him," her father said simply. "I have watched you avoid men's eyes for years now, daughter, but you looked at that man even if only for a moment. I think that means something." Ophelia wanted to argue, wanted to dismiss it as nothing, but the words stuck in her throat. Because her father was right. In that brief moment when Franklin Brennan had looked at her with what might have been respect or admiration or simple acknowledgement of a job well done, she had looked back. She had met his eyes, and the world had not ended. Her tongue had not tied itself in knots. She had simply looked. The patient, whose name was George Miller, had to stay with them for several days while his leg began to heal. It was not uncommon for her father to keep serious cases in the small recovery room he had set up behind the office, and Ophelia was used to the extra work of nursing. What she was not used to was Franklin Brennan appearing each evening to check on his fellow miners' progress. He came after sunset that first night, knocking politely at the door even though the office was clearly still open. Ophelia was changing George's bandages when she heard her father greet someone, heard that deep, rumbling voice asking after the patient. She told herself the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat was nothing, meant nothing, but her hands fumbled with the bandage pins anyway. "Miss Carson," Franklin said, appearing in the doorway of the recovery room. He had to duck slightly to clear the frame, and the small room seemed to shrink around his massive presence. "I hope I am not intruding. I wanted to see how George was faring." "He is resting comfortably," Ophelia managed, keeping her eyes fixed on her work. "The surgery went well, and there is no sign of infection so far. If that continues, he should make a full recovery." "Thanks to you," Franklin said, moving to stand on the opposite side of the narrow bed. "George is a good man, has a wife and 2 children waiting for him." "You gave them their husband and father back." Ophelia did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, just continued her work with focused attention. But she was acutely aware of Franklin watching her, could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. "I have never seen a woman doctor before," he said after a moment, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice rather than judgment. "Is it common back east?" "Not particularly," Ophelia said softly. "My father taught me. He had no sons, and I showed an aptitude for the work." "More than an aptitude," Franklin said. "You have real skill. The way you set that bone, the precision of your stitching. I have seen battlefield surgeons with less steady hands." The compliment sent warmth flooding through her chest, and before she could stop herself, Ophelia glanced up. Franklin was looking at her with that same intense expression from earlier, but there was something else there too. Something that might have been admiration, or interest, or simple kindness. Their eyes met and held for 2 full seconds before Ophelia's courage failed and she looked away, but it was longer than before. "Progress. Thank you," she whispered. "That is kind of you to say." Franklin visited every evening for the next week, ostensibly to check on George, but always staying to talk. At first, Ophelia could barely respond, could hardly force words past the tightness in her throat. But Franklin never seemed bothered by her silence. He would stand in the doorway or sit in the chair by George's bed and tell stories about the mountains, about tracking elk through snowfields and watching the sun rise over granite peaks. He spoke about the mine he was working, though it was clear his heart was not in prospecting. He was just passing through, he said, looking for something, though he would not say what. And slowly, incrementally, Ophelia found herself responding. At first just a word or two, then a sentence, then actual conversation. It was easier when she was working, when her hands were busy with bandages or medicine, and she could focus on the familiar tasks while her voice found its footing. And it helped that Franklin never pushed, never demanded she look at him or engage more than she was comfortable with. He simply kept coming back, kept talking, kept treating her like someone worth knowing. By the time George was well enough to return to his own lodgings, Ophelia realized she had been looking forward to those evening visits. Had been listening for Franklin's knock at the door and feeling disappointed on the one evening when rain kept him away. The realization terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "I suppose I will not have an excuse to visit now that George is gone," Franklin said on that last evening, and there was a question in his voice that made Ophelia's heart skip. "You could visit anyway," she heard herself say, the words tumbling out before courage could fail her. "If you wanted to. I mean if you are in town. Not that you have to, I just meant I would like that very much," Franklin interrupted gently, saving her from her own rambling. "If it would not be an imposition." "It would not be," Ophelia said, and this time when she looked up, she managed to hold his gaze for a full 5 seconds, managed to see the smile that creased his bearded face and made his gray eyes warm. Winter settled over the Black Hills with the fierce intensity common to the region. Snow fell in heavy blankets, transforming Lead into a world of white and gray broken only by the dark smoke rising from hundreds of stoves and the yellow glow of lantern light in windows. The mines continued operating, the hunger for gold undeterred by weather, but travel between the camps and town became treacherous. Franklin came to town less frequently now, sometimes going 2 weeks between visits when storms made the journey too dangerous. But he always came eventually, appearing at the door covered in snow and ice, stamping his feet on the mat and filling the office with cold air and his overwhelming presence. And always, always, he sought out Ophelia. They talked while she worked, their conversations ranging from the mundane to the profound. Franklin told her about growing up in Montana Territory, about losing his parents to cholera when he was 16 and making his own way in the mountains ever since. He spoke of tracking grizzly bears and building his own cabin with nothing but an axe and determination. He described the terrible beauty of winter in the high country, where silence became almost tangible and the stars seemed close enough to touch. In return, Ophelia found herself sharing things she had never told anyone. She spoke about her mother's death, how the fever had taken her so quickly that even her physician father could do nothing. She confessed her fears about her own inadequacy, about being too educated for most men to consider marriageable but not educated enough to attend a real medical school. She admitted her loneliness, the way she felt caught between two worlds and fully belonging to neither. "You belong exactly where you are," Franklin said firmly when she voiced this last concern. "Right here, doing work that matters, helping people who need you. The rest of the world can adjust." "That is easy for you to say," Ophelia replied, but there was no heat in it. "You are a man. You can go anywhere, do anything, and nobody questions it." "Being a man has its own constraints," Franklin said quietly. "Different ones, maybe, but just as real. I am expected to be hard, to never show weakness or uncertainty, to measure my worth in what I can build or kill or conquer. There is no room for gentleness in that world, no space for the quiet things that make life worth living." Ophelia looked up at that, really looked at him, and saw something vulnerable in his eyes that made her chest ache. This massive, powerful man who could move timbers and track bears felt trapped too, just in a different cage. The realization created a bridge between them, a shared understanding that transcended words. It was late January when the winter storm hit with devastating force. The wind howled like a living thing, driving snow horizontally and creating drifts that buried entire buildings. Ophelia and her father moved through their well-stocked office, making sure they had adequate supplies in case the storm lasted several days, as the worst ones often did. The knock at the door came near midnight, barely audible over the shrieking wind. Ophelia's father went to answer it and returned with Franklin, who was supporting another man between his massive arms. Both were covered in snow and ice, and the second man was shivering so hard his teeth chattered audibly. "Found him trying to make it back to his camp," Franklin explained, helping the man to a chair near the stove. "He would have frozen to death within the hour." Ophelia was already moving, assessing the stranger for frostbite and hypothermia. His fingers and toes were dangerously cold, his core temperature far too low. They spent the next hour warming him slowly, carefully, knowing that doing it too quickly could be just as dangerous as the cold itself. Through it all, Franklin helped with a competence that surprised her. He seemed to know exactly what was needed without being told, anticipating her requests, and moving with surprising grace for such a large man. When the stranger was finally sleeping peacefully, wrapped in blankets and out of danger, Ophelia turned to find Franklin watching her with that intense expression she was coming to know well. "You should stay," she said before she could overthink it. "The storm is too dangerous to travel in, and we have a spare room upstairs." Franklin hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and practicality, but another gust of wind rattled the windows hard enough to make the decision for him. "If you are certain it would not be improper." "My father is here," Ophelia said, though her cheeks were heating despite the logical argument. "And you saved that man's life by bringing him here. The least we can do is offer you a warm place to sleep." The storm raged for 3 days, trapping them all inside the building. Ophelia's father saw to the recovering patient while Ophelia found herself spending long hours with Franklin, their conversations deepening with each passing day. They sat in the small parlor upstairs, close to the stove for warmth, and talked about everything and nothing. On the second day, Franklin told her about why he had really come to the Black Hills. He had been tracking the men who murdered his best friend, following them south from Montana Territory. He had found them working a claim near Deadwood and turned them over to the authorities, but the satisfaction had been hollow. Revenge had not brought his friend back, had not filled the empty space his death had left. "So you stayed," Ophelia said softly. "I stayed," Franklin agreed. "I kept thinking I would move on, go back to the mountains I know, but something kept me here." He looked at her when he said it, and Ophelia felt her breath catch. She knew what he was implying, could feel the truth of it in the way her heart raced when he was near. But saying it out loud, acknowledging it, felt impossibly dangerous. "I am glad you stayed," she whispered, and it was the bravest thing she had ever said. Franklin reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his much larger one. His palm was calloused from hard work, warm and steady, and Ophelia felt tears prick at her eyes at the simple contact. "Ophelia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to look at me when I do." It took every ounce of courage she possessed, but Ophelia raised her eyes to meet his. Those storm-gray eyes held hers with an intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow was not. "I am falling in love with you," Franklin said simply. "I have been since that first night when I watched you save George's leg with hands steadier than any surgeon I have ever seen. I love your intelligence and your kindness and the way you care for people, even when they do not deserve it. I love how you blush when you are nervous and how focused you get when you are working. I love everything about you, and I needed you to know." Ophelia felt tears spill over and track down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief, of joy, of finally being seen and valued for exactly who she was. "I am falling in love with you too," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "I have been so afraid of my own feelings, so convinced that no man would ever want someone like me, but you make me feel brave. You make me feel like maybe I could be both things at once, both a healer and a woman, both competent and vulnerable." Franklin lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, and the tenderness of the gesture made Ophelia's heart feel too large for her chest. "You do not have to choose," he said fiercely. "You get to be everything you are, all of it always." When the storm finally broke on the fourth day, revealing a world transformed by snow and ice, everything had changed between them. They were careful still, mindful of propriety and her father's presence, but there was an understanding now, an acknowledgement of feelings that could no longer be denied. Franklin returned to his camp but came to town every few days, weather permitting. He began courting Ophelia properly, walking with her to church on Sundays and escorting her to the occasional social gatherings that Leeds' respectable citizens organized. And slowly, painfully, Ophelia learned to hold her head up when they walked together, learned to meet the curious and sometimes judgmental gazes of people like Martha Henderson and Sarah Whitmore without flinching. It helped that Franklin seemed utterly unbothered by the gossip that swirled around them. When Martha made a pointed comment about how unusual it was for a woman to continue working after marriage, Franklin had smiled politely and said, "I imagine it would be just as unusual for a talented physician to give up their practice, regardless of their gender. Leeds is fortunate to have two skilled healers rather than one." When a prospector suggested that Franklin could do better than a girl who acts like she is afraid of her own shadow, Franklin's smile had turned cold and dangerous. "Miss Carson possesses more courage in her smallest finger than most men demonstrate in a lifetime. She stares down death and injury every day without flinching. If she chooses to be selective about who deserves her full attention, I consider that wisdom rather than weakness." The prospector had not brought up the subject again. Spring came slowly to the Black Hills, the snow retreating grudgingly to reveal muddy streets and the first tentative green shoots pushing through the thawing ground. Franklin sold his mining claim, admitting what Ophelia had already suspected, that his heart had never been in prospecting. Instead, he began working with a logging operation in the hills, using his incredible strength to help fell and transport the timber that the growing town constantly needed. It was hard, dangerous work, but it suited him in a way that digging in the dark earth never had. He came home each evening covered in sawdust and pine sap, his muscles aching but his spirit lighter. And increasingly, home meant the rooms he had begun renting above the general store, close enough to Ophelia's father's office that he could see her windows from his own. They were married on a warm June morning in 1879, just over 7 months after Franklin had first carried George Miller through the office door. The ceremony took place in Leeds' small church, with what felt like the entire town in attendance. Ophelia wore a dress of cream-colored silk that her father had ordered from Chicago, and she carried wildflowers that Franklin had gathered himself from the mountain meadows he loved. But the most remarkable thing about the wedding was not the dress, or the flowers, or the elegant reception that followed. It was the moment when Ophelia walked down the aisle on her father's arm and raised her eyes to meet Franklin's gaze without a trace of shyness or hesitation. She looked at him steadily, openly, letting everyone present see the love and joy shining in her face. And when Franklin smiled at her, that fierce, tender smile she had come to treasure, she smiled back just as brilliantly. Martha Henderson whispered to Sarah Whitmore that it was shocking how forward Ophelia had become, but there was envy in her voice rather than true criticism, because everyone present could see what was blazingly obvious. This was a marriage built on genuine love and mutual respect, and it was a rare enough thing to make even the most cynical observer take notice. They made their home in a small house on the outskirts of Leeds, close enough to town for Ophelia to continue helping her father but far enough to offer some privacy and space. Franklin built onto the existing structure, adding a room that Ophelia could use as her own office for when patients came to them directly. He installed floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with light and built shelves for her growing collection of medical texts. Every detail was considered with her needs in mind, and Ophelia fell more in love with him each time she discovered some thoughtful addition he had made. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. They were learning to navigate sharing space and making decisions together, learning each other's rhythms and moods and needs. Franklin struggled sometimes with his protective instincts, wanting to shield Ophelia from anything difficult or painful, even when the work she did required her to face such things daily. Ophelia struggled with asking for help after so many years of determined independence, sometimes taking on too much rather than admitting she needed support. But they learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, how to be partners, how to communicate even when it was hard, how to fight fairly and forgive freely, how to celebrate each other's victories and comfort each other's defeats. They learned that love was not just a feeling but a choice, one they had to make over and over again, especially on the days when feelings ran hot or cold or simply exhausted. Ophelia continued working alongside her father, her skills and reputation growing with each patient she treated. Franklin's logging work was seasonal, slowing in the winter months, and he used that time to help around the office, moving supplies and assisting with the physical labor that Ophelia and her father could not manage alone. The town grew accustomed to seeing the massive mountain man gently carrying elderly patients or carefully holding children still while Ophelia examined them. It was in the winter of 1880 that Ophelia discovered she was pregnant. The realization brought a complicated mix of emotions. Joy, certainly, and excitement at the prospect of starting their family. But also fear, because she knew better than most the dangers of childbirth, had assisted with enough difficult deliveries to understand exactly what could go wrong. Franklin noticed her anxiety immediately, knew her well enough now to read the subtle signs others missed. He found her one evening standing by the window, one hand resting on her still flat stomach, staring out at the snow-covered hills with worried eyes. "Talk to me," he said gently, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I am frightened," Ophelia admitted, leaning back against his solid warmth. "I know too much. Every complication, every terrible thing that can happen. I cannot unknow it, cannot stop my mind from cataloging all the ways this could end badly." Franklin was quiet for a moment, his chin resting on top of her head. Then he said, "Knowledge is not your enemy, love. It is your advantage. You know what to watch for, what warning signs to heed. You have your father's expertise to guide you and your own considerable skills, and you have me every step of the way, whatever you need." "What if that is not enough?" Ophelia whispered. "Then we will face it together," Franklin said firmly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." That is what we promised each other. The pregnancy progressed normally through the winter and into the spring. Ophelia continued working until her expanding belly made it difficult to lean over examination tables, and even then, she consulted on cases and mixed medicines from a chair. Her father fussed over her with the anxious attention of both a physician and a parent, monitoring her health with exacting care. Franklin transformed into a force of protective energy, anticipating her needs before she voiced them and hovering close enough to catch her if she stumbled. Ophelia might have found it suffocating if it were not so clearly born of love and genuine concern. And truthfully, as her body changed and grew heavy with their child, she found herself grateful for his attentiveness. The labor began on a warm evening in late July, 3 weeks before Ophelia's calculations had predicted. Her father sent for the midwife while Franklin stayed by her side, holding her hand through the contractions and whispering encouragement. The labor was long and difficult, stretching through the night and into the following day. There were moments when Ophelia's medical knowledge became a curse, when she could feel her body struggling and knew exactly what that might mean. But her father and the midwife were skilled, and Franklin's presence gave her something to focus on beyond the pain. She gripped his hands hard enough to leave bruises and looked into his gray eyes when the urge to push became overwhelming. And finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that filled the room. Franklin held the baby with a combination of awe and terror, his massive hands cradling the tiny body with exquisite gentleness. Tears streamed down his bearded face as he looked from the infant to Ophelia and back again, his expression one of complete wonder. "A son," he breathed. "We have a son." They named him James Henry Brennan, after Franklin's lost friend and Ophelia's father. He was a healthy baby with his mother's auburn hair and his father's gray eyes, and he transformed their lives in ways both expected and surprising. Ophelia found herself navigating the strange new world of motherhood, learning to balance her identity as a healer with this new role. It was exhausting and overwhelming and occasionally frustrating, but it was also filled with moments of transcendent joy that took her breath away. Franklin proved to be a devoted father, unbothered by the tasks that some men considered beneath them. He changed diapers and walked the floor with a colicky baby in the middle of the night and sang soft lullabies in his deep, rumbling voice. He wore his son in a sling while he worked around their property, talking to the baby as if he could understand every word. Ophelia's father doted on his grandson with shameless favoritism, declaring him the finest baby ever born and spending hours simply watching him sleep. It brought Ophelia profound joy to see the three generations together, to watch her father's weathered hands gently touch James's soft cheek, to see Franklin's fierce protectiveness extend, to encompass this tiny, helpless person they had created. When James was 6 months old, Ophelia returned to work part-time, bringing the baby with her to the office on days when Franklin was working in the logging camps. Her father was delighted to mind his grandson between patients, and the townspeople seemed charmed by the sight of Dr. Carson walking the boardwalk with a baby in his arms. The years flowed past like water, each season bringing its own challenges and blessings. James grew into a sturdy toddler and then a curious child, following his mother around the office and asking endless questions about the medicines and instruments. When he was 4, he declared that he was going to be a doctor just like Mama and Grandpa, and Ophelia's father laughed with delight at the prospect of a third generation carrying on the tradition. In 1884, when James was 4 years old, Ophelia gave birth to twin daughters. The pregnancy had been difficult, and the birth even more so, leaving Ophelia weak and exhausted for weeks afterward. But the girls were healthy and beautiful, with Franklin's dark hair and Ophelia's green eyes, and they quickly became the center of the household's attention. They named the twins Emma and Grace, and from the beginning, their personalities were distinct. Emma was bold and adventurous, always climbing things she should not and getting into mischief with a cheerful disregard for consequences. Grace was quieter and more thoughtful, content to sit with her books and observe the world with serious eyes. Together they were a whirlwind, keeping both parents constantly busy and thoroughly entertained. Franklin expanded their house again, adding bedrooms for the children and a larger kitchen to accommodate their growing family. His logging work had given way to other ventures over the years. He had partnered with another man to start a freight business, using his knowledge of the mountain passes to establish reliable supply routes between Lead and the surrounding settlements. The business prospered, providing a stable income that allowed them to plan for the future with confidence. Ophelia's father passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1886, just a few weeks after his 70th birthday. The loss was devastating for Ophelia, even though they had known it was coming. He had been her anchor, her teacher, her greatest supporter, and the world felt emptier without his gentle presence. But he had lived to see his grandchildren, had held the twins on his lap and taught James the names of bones and organs. He had seen Ophelia become not just a skilled assistant, but a respected physician in her own right, had witnessed the town that once gossiped about his strange daughter come to rely on her expertise and trust her judgment. He had died knowing his legacy would continue, and there was comfort in that even amid the grief. The office became entirely Ophelia's after that, and she hired a young man fresh from medical school back east to assist her. Dr. Samuel Wright was eager and competent, and his presence allowed Ophelia to maintain the practice without sacrificing time with her young children. She taught him the same way her father had taught her, with patience and high standards and genuine care for their patients' well-being. Franklin continued to be her rock, her safe harbor in the storms of life. He still made her heart race when he walked into a room, still knew how to make her laugh when the weight of responsibility felt too heavy. They had settled into the comfortable rhythms of long marriage, but the passion and tenderness between them remained strong. Sometimes Ophelia would catch him watching her while she worked, and the look in his eyes would be the same one from that first winter night when he had told her he was falling in love with her. The children grew and flourished. James proved to have a genuine aptitude for medicine, spending hours in the office learning from his mother and Dr. Wright. The twins developed their own interests as they grew older. Emma loved horses and announced at age 8 that she was going to race professionally. Never mind that it was not a proper occupation for a young lady. Grace discovered a passion for mathematics and could calculate complex figures in her head faster than most adults could manage with paper and pencil. Ophelia encouraged all of it, remembering her own father's willingness to let her pursue her interests even when they fell outside traditional expectations for women. If Emma wanted to race horses, they would find a way to make it safe and respectable. If Grace wanted to study advanced mathematics, they would order every book on the subject they could find. And if James wanted to follow in his mother's footsteps and become a physician, they would support that dream with everything they had. It was not always easy, raising children in a frontier town where opportunities were limited and prejudices ran deep. But Ophelia and Franklin had built something strong together, a foundation of love and mutual respect that extended to their children. They taught them to be kind but not weak, to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult, to measure their worth by the content of their character rather than the opinions of others. In 1892, when James was 12 and the twins were 8, Lead experienced a diphtheria outbreak that tested everything Ophelia had learned in her years of practice. The disease swept through the town with devastating speed, hitting children especially hard. Ophelia worked around the clock, treating patients with the antitoxin that had recently become available and nursing the sickest cases with desperate determination. Franklin turned their home into an auxiliary hospital, setting up cots and organizing volunteers to help care for the overflow of patients. He enforced quarantine protocols with the same fierce protectiveness. He showed his family, refusing to let people break isolation even when they begged. James assisted his mother in the office, demonstrating a maturity beyond his years as he cleaned instruments and comforted frightened parents. They lost some patients, as was inevitable with such a virulent disease. Each death hit Ophelia hard, but she could not afford to break down, not when so many others still needed her. She pushed herself past exhaustion, past the point where her hands shook and her vision blurred, sustained only by Franklin's quiet support and the knowledge that giving up was not an option. The outbreak lasted 5 terrible weeks before finally burning itself out. When it was over, when the last patient had either recovered or been buried, Ophelia finally allowed herself to collapse. She slept for 16 hours straight, and when she woke, it was to find Franklin sitting beside their bed, watching over her with eyes that spoke of worry and relief in equal measure. "It is over," he said softly when he saw her stirring. "You saved so many, love. The town knows it. Everyone knows what you did." Ophelia felt tears sliding down her cheeks, all the fear and grief and exhaustion she had been holding at bay finally breaking through. Franklin gathered her into his arms and held her while she wept, his strength anchoring her the way it had for 13 years now. "We lost the Morrison twins," she said brokenly. "And old Mr. Patterson and little Sarah Collins. I could not save them, Franklin. I tried so hard, but I could not save them." "You saved dozens of others," Franklin said fiercely, tilting her face up to look at him. "You worked miracles, Ophelia. You gave everything you had and then found more when it should not have been possible. The people we lost would have died sooner and in greater numbers without you. Do you understand me? You made a difference. The lives you saved matter just as much as the ones we lost." Ophelia knew he was right, intellectually understood that she had done everything humanly possible. But it did not stop the grief, did not erase the faces of the patients she had been unable to help. Franklin held her through it, offering no platitudes or false comfort, just his steady presence and unconditional support. In the aftermath of the outbreak, something shifted in how the town viewed Ophelia. The respect had always been there, earned through years of competent care and dedication. But now there was something deeper, a recognition of the sacrifices she made and the burdens she carried. When she walked down Main Street, people nodded with genuine appreciation. Mothers stopped her to thank her for saving their children. Even Martha Henderson, who had never quite forgiven Ophelia for being different, grudgingly acknowledged her skill and dedication. The years continued their inexorable march. James left for medical school in Philadelphia in 1896, his acceptance letter bringing both pride and sadness to Ophelia's heart. Her boy was becoming a man, following the path she had helped set him on, and she could not have been more proud. But the house felt emptier without his steady presence, and she found herself missing their conversations about medicine and healing. The twins grew into young women, beautiful and fierce in their different ways. Emma did indeed pursue her passion for horses, training and racing with a skill that won her grudging respect, even from those who thought it unseemly for a woman. Grace left for college to study mathematics, one of only 3 women in her program, and wrote home about the challenges and triumphs with equal enthusiasm. Franklin's hair went gray at the temples, and laugh lines deepened around his eyes. But he was still strong, still capable of the hard physical labor that his freight business occasionally demanded. He was 50 now, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that comes from a life lived outdoors and a heart at peace. Ophelia found threads of silver in her own auburn hair, and noticed that her hands were developing the same slight tremor her father's had possessed in his later years. But at 42, she was still actively practicing medicine, still learning and growing in her craft. Dr. Wright had become a true partner in the practice, and together they served Lade and the surrounding communities with dedication and skill. They had been married for 21 years, and Ophelia still felt her heart skip when Franklin walked into a room. Still loved the way he kissed her forehead when he left for work each morning, and the way he pulled her close at night. The passion had evolved over the years, becoming something deeper and more complex than those early days of discovery. But it had not dimmed, just transformed into something richer and more sustaining. In 1899, James returned to lead with his new wife Elizabeth, ready to join his mother's practice. Elizabeth was also a trained nurse, and she brought fresh energy and new ideas to the office. Ophelia stepped back slightly from the day-to-day operations, allowing the younger generation to take on more responsibility while she focused on the complex cases and continued education. Franklin began spending more time at home too, gradually handing over control of the freight business to his partners. They were financially secure, their children launched into the world, and the future they had built together was solid and true. It was time, they decided, to slow down and simply enjoy what they had created. They took long walks in the hills, Franklin pointing out the places he had explored in those early days before he had met her. They sat on their porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold while they talked about everything and nothing. They attended church socials and town gatherings, comfortable now in their roles as respected members of the community. The new century dawned with hope and uncertainty, the world changing faster than anyone could have imagined. Lead was no longer the rough mining town it had been when Ophelia was 20. It had grown into a proper city with paved streets and electric lights, telephones, and even talk of automobiles making their way west. The wildness was fading, tamed by civilization and progress, and sometimes Ophelia missed the rawer edges of those earlier days. But she had Franklin and their children and the work she loved. She had built a life that mattered, had made a difference in ways both large and small. The shy girl who could not meet a man's eyes had become a confident woman who looked at the world directly and without fear. It had taken Franklin's patience and love to help her find that courage, but once found, it had never left her. In 1902, Emma married a rancher from Montana Territory and moved north to help run his family's operation. She wrote letters full of life and joy, describing the horses she was training and the vast open spaces she loved. Grace married a professor she had met at college and settled in Chicago, her letters filled with intellectual discussions and social observations that made Ophelia smile. James and Elizabeth had 3 children in quick succession, filling the house with the sounds of young voices once again. Ophelia delighted in being a grandmother, spoiling her grandchildren shamelessly and teaching them about herbs and healing just as her father had taught her. Franklin was 65 now, officially retired from active business, but still working around their property and helping James with various projects. His hair was fully gray, his beard streaked with white, but his eyes were still that striking storm gray and his hands were still strong. He moved a bit slower these days, but with no less purpose. They were sitting on their porch one evening in late summer, watching their grandchildren play in the yard, when Franklin took Ophelia's hand and said, "Do you ever regret it?" "Regret what?" Ophelia asked, though she suspected she knew what he meant. "All of this," Franklin gestured broadly. "Marrying a mountain man with no prospects instead of someone respectable and established, building a life on the frontier instead of somewhere safer and more civilized." Ophelia looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the gray hair and weathered skin to the man who had waited so patiently for her to find her courage. The man who had loved her exactly as she was and helped her become more than she had imagined possible. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "You gave me everything I did not know I needed. You taught me that I could be strong and soft at the same time, competent and vulnerable, a healer and a woman and a mother and a wife. You never asked me to choose, never demanded I be less than I was. How could I ever regret that? Franklin raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, the same gesture he had made that winter day 23 years ago when he first told her he loved her. I am the one who should be grateful, he said softly. You took a lonely mountain man and gave him a home, a family, a purpose beyond simple survival. You taught me that strength and gentleness are not opposites, that protecting someone does not mean controlling them. Every day with you has been a gift. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, their hands intertwined and their hearts at peace. The journey from that November day in the Mercantile to this quiet evening on their porch had been long and not without its challenges. But they had walked it together, supporting each other through grief and joy, hardship and triumph. The town of Lead continued to grow and change around them. The mine still operated, though the easy gold was long gone and the operations had become more industrial and less personal. New people arrived constantly, and old-timers moved on or passed away. But Ophelia and Franklin remained, anchors in their community, respected and valued for their contributions and their character. In 1905, they celebrated their 26th wedding anniversary with a party that seemed to include half the town. Patients Ophelia had treated, people Franklin had helped over the years, friends and family and neighbors all gathered to celebrate a marriage that had become something of a local legend. The shy girl and the patient mountain man who had built something beautiful together against all odds. James gave a toast that brought tears to Ophelia's eyes, speaking of his mother's courage and his father's steadfast devotion. Emma sent a telegram from Montana that was read aloud, her words full of love and appreciation. Grace's letter arrived late, but was no less heartfelt, describing how her parents' example had shaped her own expectations for marriage and partnership. Franklin stood and pulled Ophelia into a dance, his arms still strong enough to sweep her around the floor despite his age. She looked up at him, meeting his eyes without a trace of the shyness that had once defined her, and saw her whole life reflected there. The struggles and the triumphs, the sorrows and the joys, all of it leading to this moment of perfect contentment. "I love you," she said simply, the words as true now as they had been that winter day when she first spoke them. "I love you too," Franklin replied, his voice still deep and rumbling despite the years. "Every day more than the day before, always." They continued dancing long after the music stopped, lost in each other and the memories of a life well lived together. Around them, their family and friends watched with smiles, seeing in this aging couple a testament to the power of patience, understanding, and genuine love. The years grew gentler as Ophelia and Franklin moved into their 70s. They had slowed considerably, content to spend their days in quiet domesticity, and their evenings on the porch they both loved. James ran the medical practice with skill and compassion, carrying on the legacy his grandfather had started and his mother had expanded. His children were growing fast, showing their own aptitudes and interests. Emma had 4 children on her Montana ranch, all of them as horse-crazy as their mother. Grace had 2 daughters who showed every sign of inheriting their mother's mathematical brilliance. The family remained close despite the distances, gathering for holidays and special occasions whenever possible. In 1912, Franklin fell ill with pneumonia. Despite Ophelia's best efforts and James's modern medical knowledge, they could not stop the infection from settling deep in his lungs. Ophelia nursed him with fierce dedication, barely sleeping as she fought to save the man who meant more to her than life itself. On a cold February night, with Ophelia holding his hand and their children gathered around, Franklin Brennan took his last breath. He went peacefully, his gray eyes finding Ophelia's one final time, and she saw in them the same love and devotion that had sustained them for 33 years. The grief was crushing, so profound that Ophelia wondered if she could survive it. But she had their children and grandchildren, had the life they had built together and the memories of decades of love. She had proof, written in every line of her face and every beat of her heart, that love like theirs did not end with death. It lived on in the family they had created, in the town they had served, in the countless lives they had touched. Ophelia lived another 8 years without Franklin by her side, though she felt his presence constantly. She sat on their porch and talked to him as if he were still there, sharing stories about their grandchildren and the changes sweeping through the world. She visited his grave weekly, placing wildflowers from the mountain meadows he had loved. She died peacefully in her sleep in April of 1920, just a few months after her 80th birthday. James found her in the morning, sitting in her favorite chair with a smile on her face and Franklin's old shirt clutched to her chest. He buried her beside his father, united in death as they had been in life. The town of Lead mourned the loss of the woman who had served them for over 40 years, who had brought countless children into the world and saved innumerable lives. But they also celebrated her legacy, the example she had set, and the barriers she had broken. She had proved that women could be physicians, could balance career and family, could build lives of meaning and purpose on their own terms. And more than that, she had shown that love could transform people, that patience and understanding could unlock potential that shyness and fear had hidden, that the right person could help you become the best version of yourself without demanding you change who you fundamentally were. Her children carried forward the lessons she and Franklin had taught them. James continued the medical practice until his own retirement, training the next generation of physicians with the same patience his mother had shown. Emma became a legend in Montana ranching circles, known for her skill with horses and her fierce advocacy for women's rights. Grace published groundbreaking mathematical papers and taught at prestigious universities, inspiring young women to pursue careers in science and mathematics. Their grandchildren grew up hearing stories about the shy girl who could not look at men and the patient mountain man who had waited for her to find her courage. They learned about the love that had blossomed in a rough mining town in the Black Hills, a love built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. They carried those stories forward to their own children, keeping alive the memory of Ophelia and Franklin Brennan. The house they had shared stood for many years, eventually becoming a historical landmark. Visitors could walk through the rooms where a family had been raised and a medical practice had flourished. They could stand on the porch where Ophelia and Franklin had spent countless evenings watching the sunset. And if they were quiet enough, they could almost hear the echoes of their conversation carrying on the wind. Lead itself transformed over the decades, the mining industry eventually fading and new economies emerging. But through all the changes, the story of the shy doctor and her mountain man husband remained a cherished part of local history. A reminder that the best love stories are not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but about patience and understanding, about seeing someone fully and loving what you find there. In the end, what Ophelia and Franklin built together was more than just a marriage or a family. It was a testament to the transformative power of love, the kind that does not demand you change, but helps you grow into who you were always meant to be. It was proof that courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to face it, especially when you have someone standing beside you. And it was a story that deserved to be remembered, told and retold, a beacon of hope for anyone who has ever felt too shy, too different, too uncertain to believe they could find lasting love. Because if a mountain man could wait patiently for a shy doctor to look up and smile, if that single moment could blossom into a love that spanned decades and transformed lives, then anything was possible. Their legacy lived on in the town they had served, in the descendants who carried their blood and their values, in the countless lives they had touched through medicine and kindness, and simple human decency. And perhaps most importantly, their legacy lived on in the story itself, the tale of how patience conquered fear, how understanding overcame shyness, how true love found a way even in the rough and tumble world of the Wild West. It was a story that began with a shy glance and grew into a lifetime of love. A story that proved that sometimes the quietest beginnings lead to the most extraordinary endings. A story that demonstrated beyond any doubt that when you find the right person, the one who sees you fully and loves you completely, even the most timid heart can learn to be brave. And in the end, that was the greatest gift Ophelia and Franklin Brennan gave to the world. Not just their individual contributions, significant though those were, but the example of their partnership. The proof that love built on respect and patience and genuine care can weather any storm, overcome any obstacle, and create something beautiful that lasts long after the lovers themselves have passed into memory. Their story became part of the fabric of Leeds history, woven into the identity of the town itself. Schools taught it alongside lessons about the gold rush and the settling of the Black Hills. Parents told it to their children as proof that being different was not something to hide but something to celebrate. Young couples starting their own journeys looked to Ophelia and Franklin's example, hoping to build something even half as strong and lasting. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right through the Black Hills, people swore they could see two figures sitting on that old porch. A massive man with gray hair and a smaller woman with auburn streaks still visible in her silver locks, their hands intertwined and their faces turned toward each other with expressions of perfect contentment. It was just a trick of the light, of course, shadows and imagination combining to create meaning where none existed, but the people of Leeds liked to think otherwise. They liked to believe that a love as strong as Ophelia and Franklin's could not be contained by something as simple as death, that somewhere beyond the veil, they were still together. Still talking and laughing and watching the sunset over the mountains Franklin had loved and the town Ophelia had served. And maybe, just maybe, they were right. Because some things transcend the physical world, some connections run deeper than flesh and bone. Love like theirs, built over decades of shared struggle and triumph, tested by hardship and strengthened by commitment, earned a kind of immortality all its own. So the story of the shy doctor and her patient mountain man lived on, passed from generation to generation. A reminder of what was possible when two people found each other across the barriers of fear and circumstance. A testament to the power of patience, the importance of understanding, and the transformative nature of genuine love. It was a story that began with downcast eyes and whispered gossip in a mercantile shop. It grew through winter storms and summer sunshine, through births and deaths, through ordinary days and extraordinary moments. And it ended, if such a story can truly be said to end, with two lives fully lived and a legacy that would echo through the ages. The shy girl who could not look at men had learned to meet her husband's eyes with confidence and love. The lonely mountain man had found a home and family and purpose beyond simple survival. Together, they had built something remarkable, not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through the accumulation of thousands of small acts of love and devotion. And in the end, That was the truest measure of their success. Not the medical practice Ophelia had built or the business Franklin had run, important though those were. Not the children they had raised or the grandchildren who carried on their legacy. But simply this: they had loved each other well. They had created a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. They had proved that patience and understanding could overcome any obstacle, that true love was worth waiting for, and that the best relationships are those where both people can be fully themselves. That was the story of Ophelia Carson and Franklin Brennan. That was the legacy they left behind. And that was why, more than a century after their deaths, people still told their tale with reverence and hope, still pointed to their example as proof that love, real and lasting love, was possible even in the hardest of times and the roughest of places.